So, how much money do I actually need to bring to closing when I'm purchasing a home? So, what that number is going to be made up of is two things. One, you have your down payment for your loan, which we're going to go over some options. And two is closing costs. Closing costs to me is probably one of the most misunderstood components of a real estate transaction for a first-time buyer. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go over basically the four categories that make up your closing costs. All right. So again, last time we talked a little bit about just the budget. What is the escrow deposit? How much money do I have to have? The home inspection, how much is that going to cost? And then we finished with what's called a total cash to close. Now, today we're going to go into what are the two components of the cash to close. That's down payment, closing costs. So let's start talking about down payments a little bit. Now, a lot of people have heard of a 20% down conventional loan, right? A lot of people have talked about this. It's probably one of the most common guesses at a mortgage. And that's fine. That just means on a $100,000 home, you'll bring $20,000 cash. The mortgage company will give you an $80,000 loan. And together that equals $100,000. And that's what goes to the seller. And then the seller does whatever they have to do, pay off a mortgage and things like that. And they take their equity out of that. Okay. So 20% is good. Now, you can do lower than that, right? A lot of people say, well, I don't have $20,000, especially if you're going to go buy a $300,000 or a $400,000 house. Most people don't have $60,000 or $80,000 to then put down as their down payment. You can, and if you can, you should. It's great. But for a lot of us, that might be a little unrealistic. Or we may say, hey, I may buy a house where I need to do some renovations and I don't want to deplete my savings just on the down payment, right? So let's talk about what the other options are. Well, first, you can just offer less as a conventional. You can do 15% down. You could do a 10% down payment. You could go 5%. And there are some conventional programs where you can take it all the way down to 3%. There are some qualifiers that you have to do. But you see what I'm saying is you can really come down lower. You can pick one flat amount if you want. The whole point they generally do in 5, 10, 15, 20 is that there are rates that the lender applies to a certain down payment. And between 5 and 9, it's effectively the same. Between 10 and 14, it's effectively the same. And between 15 and 19, it's effectively the same. So you could put 18% down, but you're going to get the same rate as if you were just putting 15% down. So talk to a lender. They know more about that in specifics. But for us, it's just general rule of thumb. You get 5, 10, 15, or 20% conventional, or that 3 under certain circumstances. Now, that's a conventional loan. You may decide that you want to use something called an FHA loan. Now, why would you use an FHA loan? Well, first off, the interest rate is generally always better on an FHA loan than it is on a conventional. And you can go as low as 3.5% down for your down payment. So on a $100,000 home, you'll only have to bring $3,500 to down payment for your closing. Now that's all well and good. So you might sit here and say, well, why would anybody pick an FHA loan if it's got lower interest rates than the conventional? The FHA loan is not looked at as favorably among sellers as the conventional loan. And it's because some of the appraisal guidelines inside of that FHA loan are more strict. That loan is backed by the federal government. And so the federal government has laid their whole list of demands that the property needs to make up, from an appraisal standpoint, from a condition standpoint, that the conventional loan does not. So the conventional loan is a little bit more lenient on sellers, especially when it's the condition of their property versus the FHA loan. So that's the big difference when you're going to offer. You'll hear a lot of realtors say, hey, if you can qualify for a conventional loan, I recommend it. It's probably going to be a better way to go. It'll make your offer stronger. But if we have to, it's okay. We can go FHA. And that's real. And it's because we want to make sure we always present your terms and you as a buyer in the best light possible. And we know that a conventional loan is a more attractive loan product for sellers and for listing agents. So anyway, that's the gist of sort of the conventional, and then you have FHA. Now you have one other main loan type, which is a VA loan. So if you're active duty military or a qualifying military, you would be able to qualify for a VA loan. And you can go as low as 0% down on a VA loan. That's the whole attractiveness of it. There's one other loan type, and it is called a USDA loan. It's sort of for more like farmland and rural development. Not something I see a ton of in South Jersey. There are some areas that do qualify for USDA financing, and you can again get, I believe it's a 0% down loan there. Again, there are some hoops you have to jump through and some things like that. And I'll be honest, it's probably more common in other areas of the country, but in South Jersey, we see them sparingly. So conventional, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20% down. FHA, you can go 3.5% down. You could put more, but that's the other program. And then you have VA. So those are the three main loan types and kind of the down payments that correlate with them. So that's one side of your total cash to close. Let's flip. Let's talk about closing costs. So closing costs, again, most misunderstood component of a real estate transaction, in my opinion. There are 4 main categories that make up pretty much the entirety of what your closing costs are for a property. Now, closing costs when we estimate them, we try to always give a range. And that's because, as you'll see when we get into some of this stuff, it depends on when you close, the property and what's involved with it. There are just some differences from house to house where it's hard to, pick an exact closing cost figure. So we're going to give a range. But let's go over the 4 categories. The first one is taxes. Sellers pay taxes quarterly. January 1st, they pay from January, February, and March. And then on April 1st, they pay for April, May, and June. Okay. So let's say, for example, you were to close on your home on February 18th. I'm just picking a random day here. Well, that seller on January 1st paid all the way through the end of March. So if you're closing on February 18th, part of your closing costs as the buyer would be to compensate the seller back for the taxes that they've already paid in the quarter. So if we close on March 28th, that's going to be a very small number because there's only 2 or 3 days left in the quarter. But if you're settling on April 2nd and they've just paid for all of April, all of May, all of June, that may be quite a large number. Almost a quarter of the entire annual property taxes might be due as part of your closing costs the day of settlement, right? So your taxes and the proration of that is one of the larger components of closing costs. Let's jump to the next thing. You also have to get homeowners insurance. Now, a slab rancher with no flood zone might have, and no pool, might have a very low homeowners insurance premium, $800 a year or something like that, maybe $900 for a year. If you have a pool, you're in a flood zone, all sorts of stuff, your homeowners insurance could be $3,000 to $4,000 a year. So part of, again, your closing costs at the day of timing of settlement is you may have to pay half, 5 months of that, 7 months of it, the whole year. You may have to pay some of that premium at the time of closing to be held in escrow to then be paid out by your mortgage company every month appropriately. So again, based on the house, your homeowner's insurance will get paid at the time of closing in some proportion that you'll be aware of as you go through with it. All right, third thing, if you're getting a mortgage, you have to get a title insurance policy. So I do a whole nother video with Eric Battisti with Premier Home and Auto where we walk through the entire homeowners insurance process and we go through all that stuff. I also chat with Brendan Carey of Core Title and go over all the title insurance stuff. And so when I say title insurance, go watch that video. I'll maybe try and link it here or something like that. And you can learn about title insurance. But here's the gist of it. You have to get a title insurance policy on the property. Title fees are state regulated. And so there's very little difference between this title company and that title company when you go to buy the home. The important thing about the title company you use is that your realtor has a good relationship with them because they are the ones who are going to be making sure that when you buy this house, it's free and clear, there's no liens, there's no issues with it. And I'll be honest, not all title companies are created equally. I've seen a number of transactions where things that our title company said, hey, red flag, red flag, they go to somebody else and they say, oh, we're good to go on this. And we're like, yeah, you can do that. But in 5 years, you're going to have a big issue if you go to try and resell this and that comes back up again. So again, the third big part of this is your title insurance policy. It is mandatory. You're going to have to pay it, right? So we have our prorated taxes. We have our homeowners insurance. We have our title insurance policy. And then the last one is we got to pay the lender. We got to pay the mortgage company, right? Or the bank or credit union or whoever you're using. Most of the time, it should be a local lender, but that's who you're going to use. Okay. Mortgage fees have to be disclosed up front as you're working with a lender. You'll know all those things. So we can get into the nitty gritty, but let's just kind of wrap this back up. So when I go to close on my home, I have to bring my total cash to close number, and that's going to be my down payment of my loan plus my closing costs. So let's just run a quick example and wrap up. Let's take a $300,000 home. Okay. And I'm going to do a 5% conventional loan. Well, 5% of $300,000 is $15,000. So my down payment I know is going to be $15,000. For a $300,000 home, you may have closing costs somewhere between $8,000 to $12,000. So let's just take, for example, let's say $10,000 just for example's sake. So I have $15,000 for my down payment. I got $10,000 for my closing costs. I'm going to come to closing with $25,000. That's the budget that you need to have in order to buy that home, plus maybe $1,000 for home inspections, right? Now, if you've already, let's say you put an escrow deposit down at the time of signing your contract of $6,000. And again, we cover escrow in a previous video. You already have $6,000 with the title company. When you go to close, you're just bringing the difference, right? $25,000 minus $6,000 that's already there. I only need to bring $19,000 to close on the property, right? So anyway, that's going to kind of do it for us here, going over the big down payment and the closing costs. Next time, we'll roll right into the next part of the transaction. Talk to you then.